Hello, and welcome to part 2 of Princess Sonora and the Long Sleep. It's currently 2 a.m, and so, naturally, the perfect time for a bedtime story. I have some tea here as well, don't worry. And I hope that you are cuddled up with a blanket, tea if you like it, and some chill, cozy vibes. Last time we left off with the fairy Adriana having amended the fairy Belladonna's curse. She waved her wand. Everybody from the moat on in will fall asleep and sleep for 100 years. She chuckled. Sweet dreams. When the fairies left, King Humphrey II and Queen Hermione II had a long talk about the 100-year sleep. They should have included Sonora, who would have had lots of good ideas. But Sonora was in the nursery, being rocked in her cradle by a royal nursemaid. Maybe it doesn't have to happen, the Queen said, brushing away a tear. We'll be very groggy when we wake up. We'll issue a proclamation, King Humphrey II said. No spindles inside the castle. No needles, Queen Hermione added. Nothing sharp. Maybe if anything pricks her, she'll fall asleep. No knives, no swords, no toothpicks. We'll build a shed and keep everything in there. Belladonna didn't say when Sonora would prick herself, the Queen said. She could be 50 when she does it. No prince will marry her if he knows she's going to nap for 100 years, the King said. He could be out hunting, and when he comes home, nobody greets him. They're all fast asleep. The Queen agreed. Besides, the servants would panic if they knew. The whole court would leave. They decided to keep the 100-year sleep a secret. They didn't think of telling Sonora to keep it a secret too, because they kept forgetting how smart she was. But they didn't need to tell her, because she already knew. She'd figured it out 10 seconds after Adriana gave the gift. Now, while she lay in the darkened nursery, she was thinking it all over instead of sleeping. She'd save sleeping for her 100-year snooze. The fairy's gift would come true, Sonora decided. If her head could change shape and she could become plump just because of a fairy, not to mention getting smart twice, then of course she'd prick herself and sleep for 100 years. Sonora also figured out that her parents would try to keep the gift from happening by hiding the spindles. But wherever they were hidden, she'd find them and take one. She wasn't going to prick herself by accident at the worst possible moment. No, she would do it on purpose, when the time was exactly right. Chapter 3. The royal nursemaids couldn't get used to Sonora. It was so strange to change the diaper of a baby who was reading a book, especially a baby who blushed and said, "I'm so sorry to bother you with my elimination." In her bath, Sonora never played with her cute balsa mermaids and whales. Instead, she'd remind the royal nursemaids to wash behind her ears and between her toes. After the bath, she'd refuse to wear her adorable nightcap with the floppy donkey ears. She'd say it wasn't dignified. The king and queen had trouble getting used to Sonora too. The king hated to watch her eat. It was unnatural to see a baby in a high chair manage a spoon and fork so perfectly. She never dribbled a drop on her yellow linen bib with the pink bunny rabbits scampering across it. There were hundreds of things that the queen missed. Sonora never tried to fit her foot into her mouth. After her second word, listen, she never said. She never said another word of baby talk. She never drooled. She never gurgled. But then again, in some ways, Sonora was exactly like other babies. She had to be burped like anybody else, although other babies didn't go on and on about how silly they felt waiting for the burp to come. And most babies didn't cry from shame when they spit up on someone. Because of her loving heart, Sonora also cried whenever anybody stopped holding her. What a mood! Queen Hermione II could explain that her lap was falling asleep from holding Sonora and the heavy volume on troll psychology Sonora was reading. It didn't matter. She cried anyway. It didn't matter either if King Humphrey II said he had to meet with his royal councillors. Sonora cried anyway. And when the king said she was too young to help decide matters of state, her loving heart and her brilliant mind were in complete agreement. She had a temper tantrum. She learnt to crawl at about the same time as other babies, although she was more of a perfectionist about it than most. She set daily distance goals for herself, and she only crawled in perfectly straight lines and perfectly round circles. How boring. After a day of crawling practice, she once told her father that she enjoyed watching the miracle of child development happening to her. Although her overall health was excellent, sometimes she got sick just like other children. Except other children didn't diagnose their own diseases or tell the chief royal physician what the treatment should be. And other children got well faster than Sonora, because other children listened when their parents told them to go to sleep. Well, not that many. Sonora wouldn't listen, and Sonora wouldn't sleep. Most nights, sick or well, she'd crawl into the royal library. She could memorize 5 or 6 books in a typical night. Fairy tales were her favorites. The more she knew about fairies, she reasoned, the better off she'd be. On nights when she didn't feel like reading, she'd lie in her crib and think up questions. Then she'd answer them. For example, why did bread rise? She knew about yeast, but yeast wasn't the whole answer, because why did yeast do what it did? The whole answer fit in with Sonora's law of the purposeful behavior of everything, everywhere. Bread's purpose, she knew, was to feed people. It rose so it could feed as many people as possible. The reason jumped out at you when you thought about it correctly. She decided that when her hand was big enough to hold a pen comfortably, she'd write a monograph on the subject. Sonora didn't learn everything by reading and thinking. She also learned from the people around her. As soon as she could walk, she followed the royal dairymaids everywhere and asked them a million questions about milking. She watched the chief royal blacksmith and asked them questions. She spent days in the kitchen with the chief royal cook, until the chief royal cook wanted to pound Sonora on her royal head with the royal rolling pin. Once she found out everything the royal dairymaids knew about milking, or the chief royal blacksmith knew about smithing, or the chief royal cook knew about cooking, Sonora would get to work. She'd read every book there was on the subject. Then she'd think, and soon she'd come up with a better or faster way to milk or smith or cook or do anything else. She'd be very excited. If it was the middle of the night, she wouldn't be able to wait until morning to talk about her discovery, so she'd wake her parents up. This was always a disappointment. The king and queen were too sleepy to listen, and sometimes they were grumpy about being awakened. The king even raised his voice once when she woke him to say she'd found a way to grow skinless potatoes, which would save hours of peeling. Sonora would imagine the joy her improvements would bring the chief royal farmer or the chief royal cook or the royal dairymaids. But she'd be wrong. They were hardly ever pleased. They liked doing things the way they were used to, and they didn't like being told how to do their business by a royal pipsqueak no bigger than a mosquito bite. Sonora couldn't understand it. She knew that the purpose of dairymaids was more than to milk cows. They were people, and people had lots of purposes. If her brain hadn't told her that, her heart would have. But part of their purpose was to get milk from cows, so she couldn't understand why they didn't want to do it in the best way possible. In fact, nobody was nearly as interested in what Sonora knew as she wanted them to be. Even her mother wasn't. Often, while the Queen wrote out menu plans, Sonora would talk to her about her latest research. And for the 1000th time, the Queen would wish that Aurora had thought of a different gift. A simple one would have been fine, Queen Hermione would think. An excellent sense of smell would have been good, or a pretty singing voice, which didn't run in the family. She and Humphrey II both sounded like frogs. Then the Queen would try not to yawn. What was the child telling her now? How to build the fastest sailboat in the world? But Biddle was landlocked, and even its lakes were small. A slow sailboat could cross the biggest one pretty quickly. Queen Hermione II's eyes would close then, and her handwriting on the menu would wobble. And Sonora would feel terrible, even though she'd know her mother didn't mean to hurt her feelings. It would be the same with the king. He'd be deciding which squires were ready to be knighted, for example. Meanwhile, she'd start telling him about a book she'd read, a book that has been in his library forever without his ever wanting to read a word of it. He'd say, "Sonora, sweet, we're not as smart as you are. We can't think about knights and dwindling. Dwindling what? What's dwindling, sweetie pie?" "Dwindling unicorn habitats." "That's right, darling. Tell us about it later, when we're not so busy." Sonora would leave then, knowing that her father hoped she'd never mention a unicorn to him again, with or without a dwindling habitat. And so a new proverb sprung up in Biddle. Whenever a Biddler asked a question that nobody could answer, somebody would say, "Princess Sonora knows." Then somebody else would say, "But don't ask her," and everybody would laugh. Chapter 4. When Sonora was 6, she read every book she could find on the art of picking locks. Then, on the dark night, she stole out of the castle and went to the shed that held the spindles and other sharp things. The moment had come for her to get her very own spindle, so she'd be able to prick herself when the time was right. She set to work, ignoring the sign on the door that said, "Keep out, do not enter, private property, danger, get out of here." It took her exactly 12 minutes to pick all 10 locks, and another 15 minutes to very carefully remove the spindle from the first spinning wheel she came to. When that was done, she picked up the spindle up with the tongs from the nursery fireplace and carried it very carefully back to the nursery, where she dropped it in the bottom of her toy chest. She left it there, under the toys her parents had gotten for the child they expected to have, the one who wasn't 10 times as smart as everybody else. Every year, King Humphrey II and Queen Hermione II made a birthday party for Sonora, which never turned out well. The party for Sonora's 10th birthday began like all the rest. The lads and lasses had come only because they had to. They stood around in the tournament field, feeling silly in their party caps. Sonora tried to be a good hostess and make them feel comfortable, but every subject she brought up fell flat. Nobody wanted to discuss whether fairies and elves should obey Biddle's laws, or who was happier, all things being equal, the knight or the horse. Nobody wanted to play any games either. They had played hide and seek last year, and Sonora had told them how to play it better. It had taken months to forget her advice and get their good old game back. The year before that, she had ruined Blind Man's buff. They all sighed, including Sonora. It would be hours before she could return to her latest project, finding out why things had colors. Then she had an inspiration. She called for ink, quill pens, and parchment for everyone. When the supplies came, she began to interview each guest in turn. Sonora listened and took notes, while everybody who wasn't being interviewed grumbled about how silly and boring this was. When the last guest had been interviewed, Sonora cleared her throat nervously. This was the first time she had spoken before an assembly. She said, "Silence." Gradually, everybody got quiet. "From my notes, I see that none of you enjoys doing chores." The lads and lasses groaned. Now the know-it-all was going to tell them how to be better children. "Here are 7 good ways to avoid doing them." The lads and lasses began to write as fast as they could. During the rest of that wonderful party, which flew by much too quickly for everybody, Sonora told them how to stay out late to play, how to get even with their enemies and not get caught, how not to eat food they didn't like, and how not to go to bed at bedtime, Sonora's specialty. When the party was over, Sonora told the guests to bring their homework next year, and she'd do it for them. As they left, everyone told the king and queen that it had been the best party ever. King Humphrey II and Queen Hermione II were delighted. They told Sonora she'd be a popular queen someday. But Sonora knew better. When the lads and lasses grew up to be royal bakers or royal chimney sweeps, they'd dislike her advice as much as their parents did. They'd laugh and say the proverb to each other. Princess Sonora knows, but don't ask her. The evening after the party, Sonora moved out of the nursery to her own grown-up bedchamber, which had only one thing wrong with it: a bed. Sonora had argued that she didn't need a bed and didn't want a bed and disliked beds very much. It didn't matter, though. She was stuck with it. Late that night, when everybody else was asleep, she used her new fireplace tongs to carry the spindle very carefully from the toy chest in the nursery to the floor of her new wardrobe. She shoved it all the way to the back and covered it with a pile of nightclothes she refused to wear. Then she tried to forget about the spindle and 100 years of sleep. And we will continue that on another day. My throat is getting rather scratchy, and I think I should try to sleep. I hope that you get some good rest, wherever you are, whenever you are. I hope you remember to take your meds, drink water, and try and eat something today. Rest well, everyone. See you next time.